I think we're live. Hello, guys. Professor O'Brien here with a little discussion of other stylistic variations. Now, as you can probably tell from the title of this chapter, we're sliding into the final portions of this course. The rhetorical grammar text is now dealing with the other material. But don't think that this is the trash can. Many of the features demonstrated today are important features that Cullen and Gray were simply unsure about, which is to say they were unsure what section of their course they'd put them in. Now, let's open on page 194 and allow me draw your attention to the discussion of style here. As the text says in the chapter opening, it has a lot to do with the words chosen, but also with the ordering of those words. And I would add, it's beyond that. It's the ordering of the phrases into which those words have been assembled. And then, on top of that, it's the ordering of clauses, which make up sentences, the ordering of sentences, and the ordering of paragraphs into which you put sentences. So there's a great deal of stylistic consideration that goes into things. It's not just your choice of words. It's word order, phrase order, clause order, sentence order, maybe even paragraph order and chapter order. And bear in mind, you're going to have more than one style yourself if you're a writer. And if you're a reader, you're going to come across more than one style. As the text points out on page 194, there's the plain style. Then there's the pompous style. We want to avoid that, I guess. The grand style, the official style. These are all styles you can choose to use whenever you wish. And this connects up nicely to the sentence about, the second sentence of the paragraph opening style on page 194. You have your own style of writing, just as you have your own style of walking and whistling and wearing your hair. Now, the point on page 195 is that there's no one way to write the end of that sentence. You could say walking, comma, whistling, comma, and wearing your hair. Or you could say walking, whistling, wearing your hair. Any of these is possible. You can have the polysyndeton of all those ands, walking and whistling and wearing your hair. Or you can have the asyndeton of having no conjunctions, walking, whistling, wearing your hair. It all depends on how you feel about that sentence. Style is a personal decision. Okay. Remember, a second point that's important on page 195 is you'll probably hear a lot of Greek in this chapter. Rhetoric began with the Greeks, which is why we have Greek words like asyndeton, polysyndeton, anastrophe, and so on. Don't be freaked out by these words. They exist, but what's much more important is the concept lying behind them. I don't care if you know the word polysyndeton or asyndeton, or if you can label things with these words, but I would like you to know about the concepts behind them. Whether it's a series of conjunctions or whether it's a series omitting the conjunctions. That's the more important concept. Right. Now, absolute phrases beginning at the bottom of page 195. What's an absolute phrase? Well, the key is in the word phrase. They're not clauses. Now, an absolute phrase can take many forms. I'm inclined to say, and I might get into trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, an absolute phrase could be considered a verbal phrase missing a tensed verb. Because of course, if it has a tensed verb, it's a clause, right? Um, but it might also be missing any verb at all, particularly the verb to be, in which case it might actually look like a fragment. Now, it's probably, yeah, let's talk a little more about why you have absolute phrases. Absolute phrases typically provide extra detail about about the material in the main clause. Typically the subject, but not necessarily. Um, I like what the text says. In some cases, the absolute phrase moves the reader in for a close up. It's like a close shot in a film. Um, the main clause might be the long shot, the absolute phrase, the close up, so you can see what the expression on the person's face is, or whatever it might be. You've all seen films, you know this technique. It's also a stylistic technique in writing. No. You'll see, as the text points out, the bottom of page 196, you'll if there is a verb in an absolute phrase, it's usually a participle of some form. So let's take the weasel example, 1/3 of the way down 196. The weasel sleeps in his underground den, his tail draped over his nose. Now, I know you're going to feel that draped is an adjective, but of course it's the participle, isn't it? In this case, the past participle. And if you think about it, you could nearly, it would make the fragment very awkward, but you could put in the verb to be. His tail was draped over his nose. In that case, it would seem very odd because the phrase is behaving adjectively. So let's keep the verbs out. His tail draped over his nose. Fine. Now, let's look at the example from Flannery O'Connor at the bottom of page 196. There was no bus in sight, and Julian, his hands still jammed in his pockets and his head thrust forward. Two past participles, jammed and thrust. Now, you can also have present participles, top of page 197. He smiled a little to himself as he ran, holding the ball lightly in front of him with his two hands, his knees pumping high, his hips twisting in the almost girlish run of a back in a broken field. Okay. Take a look at the way the noun phrases are, well, there's a noun phrase, a present participle phrase, and then a noun phrase again. I'm just pulling this from the top of page 197. He saw the city spread below like a glittering golden ocean, the streets tiny ribbons of light, the planet curving away at the edges, the sky a purple hollow extending to infinity. When you recognize, you might feel like there should be a verb to be there. The sky was a purple hollow, but it's not necessary in absolute phrases like that. Sometimes noun phrase, because of course we're providing extra information about the noun, aren't we? We'll have prepositional phrases attached. Just as you see halfway down the page 197, they stopped there and sat down, their backs to the eyes of the two men in white smocks who were watching them. Their backs to, etc. Noun phrase explained a little by the prepositional phrase. You can read the other examples yourselves. Exercise 37 on page 198 is well worth doing. Coordinate series. Now, I mentioned some Greek words earlier. I want to mention them again. Polysyndeton is when you use uh, a series of conjunctions, particularly and. So the example we've given, we'll use it again. Uh, you have your own style of writing, just as you have your own style of walking and whistling and wearing your hair. You see how that series is connected up with ands, polysyndeton. Now, what if I take all those ands out? By the way, there's an error two-thirds of the way down 199. The ands are kept in there and they should be left out for asyndeton. Walking, whistling, wearing your hair. That's all that means. Now, asyndeton, there's an excellent example of it at the bottom of page 199, which I'll just read aloud. Winston Churchill was a great orator and loved to pepper his speeches and his books with rhetorical tricks. His character was stern, his manner reserved and unusually forbidding, his temper Calvinistic, his mode of life strict, frugal, austere. Wow. There's only one verb in that entire sentence, was. It's the third word. Everything else is provided using asyndeton. Fantastic rhetoric. Right, page 200, repetition. Now, you may assume that the word repetition involves repeating words, but what's meant here really is the repetition of similar structures. And there's a wonderful example provided from a speech of John F. Kennedy's at the bottom of page 200. And you can see what's happening. We shall, and then verb, noun phrase, followed by verb, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase, verb, noun phrase. And in almost all cases, the noun phrase has the word any in it. So listen to this. We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Wow, that's good rhetoric. And what's, as you can see, words are not being repeated, apart from any. The verb is different each time, and the noun is different each time, but the structure is the same. Verb, any, noun. There are some nice other examples. And I'd only draw your attention to the last of the examples in that section about Sir Richard Burton in Terence Rafferty's article. This is a Greek structure that we call anaphora. And anaphora involves opening a series of sentences with the same set of words. Or at least the same structure, excuse me. So he had X in this case. So let's look at this paragraph halfway down, page 201. He had traveled widely in Europe, Asia, and Africa. He had mastered a couple of dozen languages. He had written 7 books, and he had made a reputation as an intellectual adventurer, a man whose joy, etc., etc. But you get the idea. He had. This is anaphora, when you open a series of sentences with structures that are very similar. Okay, word order variation. It's very easy for a speaker to put his audience to sleep if the sentences are too similar. Very often, easy for a student to put a professor to sleep writing a paper where all the sentences have the same structure. So basically, the sentence beginning page 202 suggests that to rattle your reader every now and again, you probably should change up the style a little. And there are several examples. The first example from a poem of Robert Frost's, whose woods these are, I think I know. Now, that sentence, of course, should, in the ordinary plain style, read, I think I know whose woods these are. But in this case, the object comes first. Whose woods these are, I think I know. Uh, Experiment with things like this. Why is Robert Frost doing this? Maybe he wants to open with a sense of mystery. So he puts the object first, whose woods these are. Uh, Rattles you out of your complacency, makes you wonder, is it a question? And you don't quite understand what the sentence means until you get to the end. Um, Note the example at the top of page 203, putting an adverb or an adverbial in opening position. You would normally say something like, I had never before seen such an eerie glow in the night sky. But take the never before and put it at the start. Works just as well. Never before had I seen such an eerie glow in the night sky. That really emphasizes the adverbial, doesn't it? Look at the third example there, 1/3 of the way down, page 203. Winston Churchill again. In this case, we have the subject coming last. A prepositional plus an absolute phrase coming first, and the verb coming after that. This puts a great deal of weight on the reader, but sounds rhetorically grand. Against Lee and his great Lieutenant Stonewall Jackson, united for a year of intense action in a comradeship which recalls that of Marlborough and Eugene, were now to be marshalled the overwhelming forces of the Union. Now, you'd expect the subject to come first. The overwhelming forces of the Union were now to be marshalled, blathery blah. But instead, you're shaken out of your complacency by the prepositional phrase coming first. Against Lee, etc., etc., were now to be marshalled. Sometimes you might simply want to invert the predicate and the subject. And I know it isn't neat with verbs to be, because after all, John is the king. Both feel like the subject, but let's just call John the grammatical subject here and you'll get the idea. Pierce Paul reads The Templars. The conversion of Constantine was of momentous consequence for Christianity. Equally significant for the future of the empire was his decision to move its capital from Rome to Byzantium on the Bosphorus. Now, a plain sentence would read something like, his decision to move the capital, blah, 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 was equally significant. Instead, the predicate has been put into the first position of the sentence. It's to shake you up and maybe to underline how important this move of Constantine was. And finally, an example of taking adjective phrases out of the noun phrase and putting them at the start. Hot and tired, the hikers trudged the last mile to their campsite. Now, you could just as easily say the hot and tired hikers trudged the last mile to their campsite, or the hikers, comma, hot and tired. But instead, you can move that to the start of the sentence. These are all experimental techniques that you can have fun with. Ellipsis. Now, we've seen the example of ellipsis before, Churchill's description of Stonewall Jackson. And ellipsis just means leaving things out. In this case, it's the verb to be. And it's an example we provided already, but I'll do it again. Note that the verb to be appears in the third place in this sentence, and that's it. It never appears again, even though it could appear another 5 or 6 times. His character was stern, his manner reserved and unusually forbidding, his temper Calvinistic, his mode of life strict, frugal, and austere. Now, you'll agree almost everything there could have a verb to be thrown in, but Churchill relies on you to realize that that was is going to cover all of the phrases that come after as well. This is a rhetorical technique you need to experiment with before you'll be confident with it, but it's well worth experimenting with. Antithesis, page 205. Now, antithesis isn't necessarily negating what was said before, but it does provide the sense of apparently negating what came before. As the definition gives it at the top of page 205 there, the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas often in parallel. It's the apparent contrast of ideas. It's a lovely example from Neil Armstrong there. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, these seem opposite, right? The small step and the giant leap. But by extension, we understand what he means. Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon, representing mankind, is in fact philosophically a gigantic leap. Note the contrast of slave and master in George W. Bush's inaugural speech. Across the generations, we have proclaimed the imperative of self-government because no one is fit to be a master and no one deserves to be a slave. This is antithesis. You see the two opposites, and you're initially shaken up before you see what's being said. They mean the same thing, but attention is being drawn. Benjamin Franklin, there never was a good war or a bad peace. You have to think about that again, don't you? Neither means the same thing, and they seem to be opposites, but it's understandable what he means. War is bad, peace is good. There are several other nice examples there that I don't need to provide. Read them all, however, because antithesis is a beautiful and poorly used rhetorical tool in the writing student's toolkit, indeed in the literature student's toolkit. Deliberate fragments, I've spoken about these before. I'm not the big fan of them that Cullen and Gray are, but I recognize that they do have a use. There's John le Carré's novel, Our Candidate Begins Speaking, a deliberate, unimpressive opening. Now, that second sentence isn't really a sentence, is it? Because there's no verb. It's just a noun phrase. A deliberate, unimpressive opening. In plain English, you might want it was at the start of that sentence, but it's not being provided. The it was is understood. John le Carré is breaking grammatical rules, but he's breaking them because he knows how to break them. Like I tell students, if you're going to break a rule, know why and know when you're breaking a rule. Most, perhaps all of these cases are noun phrases, interestingly enough. Barack Obama provides two sentences here in his memoir, both of which are fragments, noun phrases. 3 o'clock in the morning. The moon-washed streets empty, the growl of a car picking up speed down a distant road. There's no danger of this being understood. Usually the verb to be or something similar is implied. There was a car in the road. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The verb to be becomes optional very often if it's clearly understood what's meant in the sentence. So that's all I want to say about stylistic variation. Hopefully you'll get some use out of that, and I will be seeing you all soon, I hope. Take it easy, everyone.